Welcome to this review retrospective of my use of the Mate desktop environment in Solus Linux. It's been about 2 months or so, roughly, since I installed Mate, the Mate edition, I should say, on my computer. And I didn't do gaming that entire time, mostly because of Divinity 2 having issues playing videos. But for the most part, after I got done playing that game, I was able to thankfully come back to Linux and use it again because honestly, I've just got to the point now where I appreciate and like using Linux more than Windows so much. Windows just feels so archaic to me. But anyway, what I want to talk about here in this video is I want to go ahead and highlight some of the Solus features for Mate desktop environment and maybe some of the things that are fairly unique possibly to it. And then also basically my thoughts on Solus Linux itself, since I've been using it for, I'd say, either 5, maybe 6 months or so, the different editions. And I've gotten a pretty decent feel for the distribution, and I just kind of want to talk about it. But we'll start with the Mate environment. As you can see here, this is basically the default wallpaper that comes with the Mate desktop environment, and yeah, that's a beautiful wallpaper. I definitely got to say that Solus Linux, they definitely have very good wallpapers. But this one's probably my favorite one, to be honest with you. I just like, mountainous terrain. That's just something I really like for wallpaper. So this is a great wallpaper. And I would say that the Mate desktop environment would be what you could consider their low spec desktop environment. But let me go ahead and bring up this terminal real quick. And hopefully the font's a little bit bigger there so you can actually read it. But basically, this gives you a little idea of what the current version of Solus is running right now. And in fact, I literally just upgraded not even 30 minutes before doing this video. And for the most part, I didn't have any issues at all upon reboot. The only thing I did have an issue is I like to use a pulse audio module by the name of Echo Cancellation, and that basically got wiped out in the upgrade. But it was very simple to go back into the default.pa file and re-add that module, and so I'm back to my microphone sounding good, because it just sounded muffled without that module. But if you don't do a lot of recording or things of that nature, it may not be that big of a deal to you. Now, one thing, let's see here. Let's go ahead and run up HTOP as well. So right now, with a few things running, OBS Studio and the file manager, you see I'm using just about a gig of memory. So it's very lightweight. And I did do a comparison because one of the neat things about this version of Mate is it comes with two different window managers you can use. So right now I have the Compiz window manager enabled, and that gives you all the nice little desktop effects, like you see the wobbly windows, or if you minimize, maximize, you can see it has a little more flash to it. And I thought, well, that might make a bigger imprint on the RAM usage. So I did a comparison. So the default window manager that comes with Mate goes by the name of Marco. And on a fresh boot, I was using about 600 megs of memory. Pretty low memory footprint. And I would like to keep in mind that I do have down here in the bottom right, you should see this little icon. That's for the Variety wallpaper changer. I'll get to that in a second. But so I do have a wallpaper changing program or slideshow program running in the background when I first boot up the machine. So even with that running, it was only using 600 megs of memory. Now, when I put on the Compiz window manager, I kind of expected it to bump up quite a bit, but it only went up to about 625. So if you want a little flashier of a desktop environment, uh, memory usage wise, there's not a huge difference between Marco and Compiz. That's really cool. Now, I know that some people like to use lots of workspaces and whatnot, and with Compiz, you could do the whole desktop cube and get even more flashy effects and whatnot. But I'm kind of a simple person. I just like to have the one workspace. So, but if you like multiple workspaces, you can turn on Compiz and have even more flashy effects, basically. So let's go ahead and talk, other than the fact that you can use two different window managers, which is really neat. And in fact, I ended up having to use the Marco window manager when I was playing Bioshock Infinite because there was just a lot of screen tearing. And believe it or not, that did come down to my window manager. So when I went from Compiz to Marco, everything seemed to work better as far as screen tearing is concerned. So I'm not really sure why that game was a little more sensitive to that, but it's really been the only game I've ever had any issues like that with. So maybe that was probably a one-off. I'm not entirely sure, but that's the thing is with this desktop environment set up the way it is, you can change your window manager to see if that helps improve things. That if you're having any issues, and for me that was something that was an obvious improvement. Now, not that long ago, I did a video on the Budgie desktop environment. And one of the issues I had with the Budgie desktop environment was I couldn't move my icons around. Well, I can show you right here, that is not an issue here under Mate. So that is a definite improvement for me over the Budgie desktop. And I don't want to throw shade at the Budgie desktop environment. It is a good one, but my personal preference, I feel that at least if I had to choose between Mate or Budgie right now on Solus, I would choose the Mate desktop environment. And there's quite a few different reasons. Desktop icons probably being one of the more minor of them, especially if you're one of those people who don't like a lot of desktop icons. I like to have a minimal set of icons, which you can see I don't really have a lot on my desktop. We'll go ahead and pull up the menu real quick. So I will say the menu, it's basically fairly utilitarian. There's not a lot of flash to it and whatnot. Everything is just kind of in its space basically. So it's not very, I wouldn't say it's flashy or has a lot of information. It gets the job done. But it does have this control center down here, which is really neat. They did have the Budgie settings that you could pull up, but it didn't have nearly the amount of stuff in it that you could do here in the Mate control center. So there's a lot more things that you can modify and tweak to your needs, basically. The first one being, of course, the Mate tweak. And this is the one I was telling you about, where basically you can go down here and you can choose your window manager. You can choose between Marco with no compositor or Compiz, or I don't really know what the difference between the built-in X% and the no compositor was in Marco. I didn't really see a huge difference, but that's something you can do. You can change, they have 4 different panel layouts, but honestly, I didn't really see much of a difference between any of these 4 panel layouts. So maybe that's just me not being attentive to details, I guess. And then, of course, here on the desktop, you can basically get rid of things that you don't want to show up. If you don't want to have trash or home show up, you can have just computer if you wanted. So you can actually pick and choose, or you can say no desktop icons. If you don't want any desktop icons, you can do that here from the Mate tweak. One of the neat things is if you're using the Compiz window manager, you have this Compiz settings config that you can use. And this is where you can turn on stuff like the wobbly windows, window decoration, minimize effect, and you can play with all the different visual presentation to your heart's content. As you see here, I don't really have all that much turned on. Like right here, desktop cube. That's like when you're swapping your workspaces around. So you can turn on a whole bunch of different things. I just really haven't done anything like that, but you can do that for sure. One thing I will say that I've noticed here from a usability perspective compared to the Budgie desktop environment, you do have to, for theming, you do have to download themes via the Software Center just like you do in Budgie, or at least that's probably the preferred way of doing it here in Solus Linux. But a very neat aspect to the Mate environment is you can go in here to custom. This is something that I didn't see in Budgie per se. And it just could be something that I completely and totally overlooked. But for instance, I chose the Vimix Dark Ruby for the controls because I like that dark color with a red background. That's just one of my favorite color schemes. But then I was able to choose the Yaru Dark for like the X and the minimize and maximize buttons. And so you can actually download multiple themes and you can pick and choose what aspect of that theme you want to use. So you're not stuck having to use, say, all of Yaru Dark or all of Vimix Dark Ruby. You can actually pick and choose which one you want. And I didn't really play a lot with the icons, but there are a lot of icons that you can download. So you could actually choose icons and pointers. I think, yeah, I got the more white pointer to kind of offset the dark theme. But that's a really neat effect that you can do, or a theming modification that you can do. So you can pick and choose from different themes. So you're not stuck to just one theme. So, as before, you've got your hardware drivers here. And you see I've got the NVIDIA graphics driver installed. And a good thing to highlight real quick is, like I said, there were literally updates that I did like not even 30 minutes before doing this video. And there was a kernel update. And as always, when I do a kernel update, when you have NVIDIA drivers, it could cause issues. But one thing I got to say with Solus, every time I've had a kernel update, I haven't had a single issue with my video drivers not working and the X display not coming online. So it's definitely one of those things that I haven't had to worry about, especially not with either Budgie or the Mate version of Solus. It just works. I mean, for lack of a better word. And so that's a great thing for anybody who's using NVIDIA graphics. So yeah, you can tell there's a whole bunch more options that you can do here from the control center. There's just a lot of things to do. Linux Steam integration, this is one of the things that comes with it. And I think initially the use native runtime was enabled, and I turned that off. But you can actually come in here and you can play around with the Steam integration. But other than turning off the native runtime, I think I didn't have to do much with the Steam integration. So that worked great for me. Let's see. So that comes from mostly theming. One of the things that kind of like with the Budgie desktop environment, because this is a GTK-based desktop environment, for some reason, they didn't include a slideshow utility as part of the desktop environment. So I did have to download the Variety desktop wallpaper switcher, and I use that to cycle through wallpapers. So if you do like to have different wallpaper cycle at a certain interval, say like every 3-6 hours or every hour if you want, then basically you will have to download the Variety program to do that. But it works great. It's one of those things that I wish was actually part of the desktop environment, but it's not. Other than that, one of the things I could definitely say that I like about the Mate desktop environment over the Budgie one is it has a lot better um, default applications right out of the box. So, for instance, it has the VLC video player immediately, and I like VLC much more than I did MPV in Budgie, for instance. And Budgie was very much tied to the GNOME desktop environment. So that's why they went with a lot of the GNOME applications. Whereas the Mate team actually has a very large suite of their own applications that they've come up with. And let me see if I can highlight some of them. Let's see here. They have the Mate calculator, a search tool. Probably one of the only aspects of this desktop environment that I'm not a huge fan of is their text editor, Pluma. I don't know. I mean, it works when you pull it up like this, but like if you go to open up a text document, for instance, it will ask you to display, or it pops up a window saying, "Hey, how do you want me to do this?" It's like, I just want you to open the freaking text document. But other than that, I mean, it's a functional text editor, but I think that's probably one of the few applications on the Mate desktop environment that I feel is probably not very good. And it's probably just because of that pop-up. And I haven't really figured out any way of turning that off. I'm sure there probably is, but I just lazy and didn't bother looking it up. But the Mate, let's see, would it be under Office? Yeah, Attrell Document Viewer. So if you read PDF documents, I personally like the Attrell Document Viewer much better than Events that comes with the Budgie and the GNOME desktop environments, and previous and next. It just works a lot better, in my opinion. And you can also tell some of the theming here. You got the nice rounded corners in the top, so they do have that rounded corners thing going for them. But yeah, I feel that a lot of the Mate default applications just work better. Oh, here's one. Let's pull this up. This is the file manager, or the file browser, as it were. And at the time when I was using the one for Budgie, I thought, hey, you know what? This works pretty good. It's not bad. But then I use this one. This is called Kaha. I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce that. And Kaha, excuse me, it's just a much better file manager even. So even the file manager is better in this desktop environment as compared to Budgie and GNOME, at least from my point of view. I just like it a lot better. So there's that. The terminal is, well, I mean, you saw here. Here's a terminal, basically. All of the Solus terminals have pretty much the same coloring and things of that nature. So they keep a fairly consistent look across them. And so this would kind of give you an idea of what things look like. But basically, yeah, it has a fairly consistent look, and I can't really say it's any better or worse than, say, the one on Budgie or GNOME. But it's definitely functional. It's just a terminal. But then again, I'm not as picky about my terminal as some people would be, possibly. Let's see here. We got system tools. Now I downloaded Multiwriter, but there's another one I did. Yeah, Etcher. I think that one works better if you're burning an ISO to a USB, for instance. I tried using Multiwriter. It's okay. I mean, they're both fairly similar. You have the Mate system monitor here if you want something a little more graphical to see, what your resource usage is. So there you go. Pretty bare bones, but it gets the job done. And let's see here. Disk usage analyzer. They got quite a few things in here. They even have gparted installed by default, which is pretty good. Other than that, that's another thing. You can either pull up the control center like I did, or you can actually access everything here from the preferences menu. So that's really neat. But overall, I think that's one of the things I would say is better for the Mate desktop environment. Is it's lighter on RAM usage out of the gate, and it's probably one thing I'm going to try to do from here on out. Is I'm going to try to actually record how much RAM is being utilized when you first start up your computer. And for me, I've noticed that with Mate desktop environment, there wasn't much of a difference between Marco and Compiz, but I haven't done that for the KDE versions and the Budgie versions. I've heard they're a little heavier on RAM usage. Well, I think I've heard mixed things as far as that's concerned. I've heard like KDE is actually lighter on RAM usage nowadays. I still think the Mate environment is probably the least intensive from a resource perspective. And so if you're definitely running older hardware, I think you'll be fine running pretty much anything here. Um, I will say that the visual layout is very similar between Mate and Budgie as far as Solus is concerned. I think that's kind of one of the things they try to do is they try to keep everything fairly consistent. You are missing the Raven panel that you had on the Budgie desktop environment, but other than that, I think just straight out of the box, the applications work better with Mate, and or they have better applications by default, and everything just works a little bit better in my opinion. Now, if I was to compare all three of the desktop environments I've used with Solus, I'd probably rank them KDE, Mate, and then Budgie in that order. And it's pretty close amongst all of them, to be honest with you, because all three of the desktop environments, I actually enjoy my time using all of them. But I will say that I think the KDE desktop environment at this time has a little more polish, and even their applications like the KDE applications have just a little bit better polish than the other ones, at least in my personal opinion. Um, but I can't sit here and say that with the Mate desktop environment I didn't enjoy using it, because I did actually like using it. It worked very well. Now I kind of want to talk about Solus in general. I kind of briefly mentioned that it is a rolling distribution, and I think I just recently made a comment about this. Not that long ago, they just upgraded the kernel to 5.15, and so even though it's a rolling distribution, it's not the fastest to put out the latest version. I believe the most recent Linux kernel you can get right now is 5.17. So with them just coming out with 5.15, they are definitely behind, and they are definitely behind even fixed released distros like, say, Fedora, for instance. Fedora, I think, has a more recent kernel version than Solus. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. They're very careful about what they put out or when it comes out. So every week you get updates on Friday or Saturday morning, I guess, depending on what part of the world you're in. And honestly, for the most part, I've almost never had any issues pulling an update. There'll be quite a few updates. I think there's like 110 today, and all those updates went through without any issues. Everything booted up. Like I said, the only thing I had an issue today, and this normally is not an issue, was my audio, and it took me all of 2 minutes, if even that, to fix it. And that was the only issue that I had with an update. And usually when I update, that's not a problem. Um, if you're using NVIDIA drivers, sometimes you might have to sit there and cross your fingers when you see a kernel update, because your X display might not come back online. And I've seen several kernel updates happen with Solus now across the various editions I've used, and it's always come up fine. The only problem that I've had recently with Solus, and I do want to go ahead and point this out, is I literally just bought this wireless adapter, if you can see that there. It's a AC600. I mean, I think just yesterday or a couple of days ago, I bought that because I wanted to see if I can improve my internet speed because the built-in Wi-Fi on my motherboard is only a BGN, so it can only go so fast. It's going pretty good, and it's actually working very well now that I'm using a Wi-Fi setup, which is a completely different story. um, why I've gone to Wi-Fi, but basically, this adapter is the only thing that I've ever used in Solus that didn't work. And I did find some guides online to get it working, but they had information for Fedora, Ubuntu, and OpenSUSE, believe it or not. And I think I could probably even get it working under Arch, even though it didn't explicitly mention Arch, or at least I don't remember it mentioning Arch. But there was a certain package missing called DKMS that is needed to basically build the drivers from source, and unfortunately, that's missing in Solus. So up until, like I said, just a couple of days ago, I haven't had any issue with any of my software, or hardware, excuse me. You know, the microphone, the webcam, this little device here that I use to hook my Wii U Pro controller to the computer. Everything's worked. And that's been the only piece of hardware I've had that doesn't work. And that's the one small downside to using Solus is you do have a very limited software center because it's a completely independent distribution. So they compile everything from source. Now, I might have been able to possibly do a little more research and get the drivers for this working, but I'm actually getting to that point now where I'm about to finish using this edition of Linux and want to try out a different distribution. So I didn't really put forth a lot of effort, but I think that's something that you may need to keep in mind depending on your hardware setup. Solus is actually it's a very good distribution. In fact, I think if you download it currently, it comes with a 5.14 kernel with the latest download. When I say latest, it's from early last year, actually. So they're probably due to put out a new ISO pretty soon. But if you do download the version that they have now, I think it's 5.14, the kernel. So even if you're running an AMD Ryzen CPU, a fairly recent one, you should be good to go. Whereas if you download something, say a Debian Bullseye based distribution where the kernel's 5.10 out the gate, you're going to have problems. So it's not cutting edge or bleeding edge like, say, Fedora or Arch based or anything of that nature, but it does keep itself updated fairly frequently. I mean, there was a bit of a lag there to get the 5.15 kernel, and I think a lot of that had to do with the holidays. But they keep things up to date, and your desktop environment stays up to date. So you're not stuck with the same desktop environment. As new things come out, it will get pushed out to you, on a fairly quick basis. And that's one thing I noticed. Another thing about the KDE is the KDE desktop environment got updates a heck of a lot faster than the Budgie one. And actually, Mate, for the most part, actually, there weren't a lot of desktop environment updates. There actually were this week, believe it or not. But for the most part, I'd say the KDE desktop environment and probably GNOME get updates a lot more frequently than Mate and Budgie. At this point in time, I definitely can recommend Solus Linux to people who are running, older hardware. My hardware, for instance, is the motherboard is it's almost a decade old at this point, and I haven't had really any issues. My video card is, I don't know, about 5-6 years old, give or take, and it works really well. It is NVIDIA, so I'm not using open source drivers, but for the most part, everything just works. And The only thing is, I will say that the Software Center. Well, this is a good or a bad thing. Take your opinion on it. Basically, regardless of what version of Solus you download, the Software Center is the same amongst all of them. Well, that's interesting. It didn't change my theming here. So this is actually the Vimix Dark Ruby theming on the Software Center. So theming can be somewhat hit or miss, but for the most part, it's usually pretty decent. Um, so one of the things you can look at is, regardless of which edition of Solus you use, you're going to have the same Software Center. And everything here is basically curated by the team because, like I said, it is an independent distribution. So they're not hooking up to the main Debian repository or Arch repository or something along those lines. So everything is pretty much, they build it from scratch basically. And it works really well, but depending upon your needs, it could be limited. And if you, depending on the type of software you need, if you can't find it here in the Software Center, and there's a decent chance you can't, look to see if the Flatpak is available, and you can just install it via Flatpak. That was my big issue with the drivers for this, is DKMS is not exactly something you're going to find on Flatpak. So there was a couple of Flatpak programs I ran, as you saw in my NeoFetch output. I think I had 6 Flatpak programs, but there's probably only one program really. So Flatpak is definitely one of those things that you can use to get around the limited Software Center, but I would point out that that is something to be aware of, especially if you're coming from an Ubuntu-based distribution where you have a very large repository of software to choose from. And that's probably one of the biggest downsides to Solus, is that you do have a limited repository of software. But for the most part, that hasn't really affected me as a standard desktop user or a gamer. Everything's worked pretty good. And let me talk about gaming real quick, since I have tried a lot of stuff out over the last 6 months or so. I will say that Lutris is a really good front end. And Citra, that's what I was installed. Lutris is a very good front end. And so, like, if you have a GOG account like I do, Lutris can hook up with your GOG account and you can download stuff. And one of the nice things about it is you can use customized versions of Wine, and you can have a built-in Wine environment specific to that game, which is really nice. And that's probably one of the things I would give this a nod over, say, Mini Galaxy, because Mini Galaxy uses your system Wine. And system Wine can work good, but if you come across one of these games that needs a lot of special packages installed or flags or things of that nature, you could mess up your Wine environment experimenting. A good example of that was when I was trying to get Divinity 2 to work. I broke my Wine environment many, many times trying to get that thing working. And of course was very unsuccessful. But one of the things is, when I do it here in Lutris, I can just uninstall the game and everything with it to include the Wine environment, and then I can try again, and I haven't messed up the overall Wine on my system. So that is good. And another thing you can tell here with Lutris, if you use, say, Humble Bundle, I hate that, Epic Game Store or Origin or even Ubisoft Connect, you can connect all of those to your Lutris front end here, which I don't have any accounts with these people or these companies, so I can't really show you anything from there. But I don't know why you would use the Steam integration. I mean, it's something you can use, but the Steam client itself works great under Linux, and especially under Solus. So I think I would just use Steam for that. But all the other ones, you can integrate it with Lutris, and Lutris works great. It's definitely something I would highly recommend for people who do have games outside of the Steam ecosystem. And for the most part, the last 6 months or so of me gaming on Linux, I can say that Linux gaming it's thriving now. It really is. Um, and Divinity 2, I was able to get it to work. The only thing I couldn't get going were the movies. And since I had never played the game, that's why I booted into Windows to play it, so I could actually see the movies. I could play them manually, but during the whole storyline, that wasn't very feasible. Outside the movies, it ran great under Linux. It looked amazing, so everything worked great. And I mean, even in the last couple of months with Steam updating Proton to 7 over the 6.5 that was there before, the compatibility has gone up even higher. And you're starting to see things really fly as far as compatibility is concerned. And it keeps going up and up. And with the Steam Deck coming out now, if you stayed away from Linux before because you were worried about gaming, you wouldn't be able to play a lot of your games, it's something to look into because it has improved leaps and bounds. And even within the last 6 months, I have seen a huge increase in compatibility and just things working great. So, and Solus is a great example of a distribution you can use to get some good gaming in, as well as web browsing, office work, and the like. So anyway, I do recommend Solus, especially if you have older hardware. It should detect everything without any issues, and even a lot of newer hardware like Ryzen-based CPUs and whatnot. So definitely give it a try, but just keep in mind if you do come across a piece of hardware that they don't have hardware drivers for, you would probably have to put in a request to get that done, and it may never come about because it is a small team of developers, and there's only so much they'll do as far as hardware drivers. Other than that, it's definitely worth trying out. And Mate, for those people who have a, a low resource computer like 2 gigs of memory or so, I think the Mate desktop environment works great, and Solus team has done a very good job, and it looks nice. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. I'll see y'all in the next one. Take care.